You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you? The words hung in the stale cabin air like a challenge spoken not with arrogance, but with the quiet authority of someone who had just spent 30 consecutive hours holding beating hearts in her hands. Dr. Amelia Richardson stood in the aisle of Flight 847, blood trickling down her temple, staring at a pilot who had just made the worst mistake of his career. But to understand how we got to this moment of reckoning, we need to go back 6 hours earlier to Massachusetts General Hospital, where Amelia was finishing what would be remembered as one of the most complex pediatric surgeries in medical history. At 35, she was already being whispered about in the same breath as medical legends, a woman whose steady hands had separated conjoined twins born with shared cardiac tissue, a procedure so delicate that one wrong move would have meant losing both children. The surgery had taken 28 hours. 28 hours of standing over an operating table, guiding instruments with precision, measured in millimeters, making decisions that would determine whether two families went home with their babies or with memories. The media had called it miraculous, but Amelia knew better than most that miracles were just medicine practiced with absolute precision under impossible pressure. Now, exhausted beyond description, she was catching the red-eye to Los Angeles, where she was scheduled to receive the International Humanitarian Medical Award for her work providing free cardiac surgery to children in developing countries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was flying coach wearing a faded MIT sweatshirt and jeans that had seen better days, looking more like a graduate student than one of the world's most respected surgeons. She had specifically requested the aisle seat 14A, knowing that her long legs would need the extra room and that she'd probably have to get up frequently to stretch during the 6-hour flight. Her carry-on was a simple black backpack containing her laptop, the speech she'd written for tomorrow's ceremony, and a few medical journals she hoped to catch up on if sleep eluded her. As passengers filed past her toward their seats, Amelia closed her eyes and tried to let the tension of the past day drain from her shoulders. She had learned long ago to use travel time as decompression, a way to shift from the hyper-focused surgeon who held lives in her hands to the woman who could appreciate a sunset or laugh at a bad movie. The flight attendant making her way down the aisle was Monica Chen, a 15-year veteran with Delta who prided herself on running an efficient cabin. Monica had seen it all in her years of service, from celebrities trying to sneak their pets into first class to businessmen who thought their status entitled them to rewrite the rules of air travel. She had developed a sixth sense for spotting trouble before it started, and something about the young black woman in 14A triggered her internal warning system. Maybe it was the casual clothes on a late-night business flight, or the way Amelia had her hood up like she was trying to avoid attention. But Monica filed her away mentally as someone to watch. In her experience, passengers who looked out of place usually caused problems, and the last thing she needed on a full flight was drama. 3 rows behind Amelia, Captain Blake Harrison was conducting his final pre-flight checks with the kind of methodical precision that had earned him a spotless safety record over 22 years of flying. At 48, Blake was everything central casting would order for an airline pilot, with platinum blonde hair that was still thick, a square jaw that suggested competence, and shoulders that filled out his uniform in a way that inspired confidence in nervous flyers. But beneath the professional exterior, Blake was carrying weight that had nothing to do with aircraft specifications. His divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, taking with it half of his assets and most of his confidence in his ability to read people. His ex-wife had blindsided him with papers served at the airport claiming he was emotionally unavailable, and that his obsession with work had killed their marriage. The financial strain was real. At 48, he was facing mandatory retirement at 65, which meant he had exactly 17 years to rebuild his savings and secure his future. Every flight mattered now. Every on-time arrival was a building block toward the pension that would determine whether he spent his golden years in comfort or scraping by. His performance reviews had become his lifeline, and his superiors had made it clear that maintaining Delta's industry-leading punctuality statistics was non-negotiable. Tonight's flight was particularly important because it carried a full complement of passengers, meaning maximum revenue, and the weather forecast showed clear skies all the way to LAX. A perfect flight would put him closer to the quarterly bonus that could help offset his alimony payments and maybe even allow him to start dating again without the embarrassment of suggesting dinner at chain restaurants. As Blake completed his checks, he noticed the delay notification on his screen. They were already 12 minutes behind schedule due to a mechanical issue with the auxiliary power unit that had required maintenance attention. 12 minutes might not sound like much to passengers, but in Blake's world, it was the difference between a performance review that praised his efficiency and one that questioned his ability to manage unexpected challenges. He keyed his radio to communicate with ground control, his voice carrying the crisp authority that passengers found reassuring. Ground Delta 847 requesting immediate clearance for pushback. We're showing green across the board and ready to make up time in the air. The response crackled back through his headset. Delta 847, you're cleared for pushback. Be advised, weather window is optimal for the next 40 minutes. Then we're looking at potential delays due to traffic density. Blake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the challenge of a tight schedule. This was what he lived for, the chess match against time and logistics that separated good pilots from great ones. He had no way of knowing that in approximately 18 minutes a titanium briefcase would fall from an overhead bin, setting in motion a series of events that would end his career and change aviation medicine forever. Trevor Walsh was having the worst day of his professional life, which, considering he managed hostile takeovers for a living, was saying something. The merger deal that was supposed to secure his partnership at Goldman Sachs had fallen apart spectacularly when due diligence revealed that their target company had been cooking their books for 3 years. 18 months of work gone. 18 months of 18-hour days, missed family dinners, and canceled vacations, all for nothing. He was heading to Los Angeles for what his managing director had euphemistically called a strategy session. But Trevor knew it was really a damage control meeting where he'd be thrown under the bus for missing the red flags that everyone else was pretending they hadn't missed too. His job was probably safe, but his partnership track was definitely dead, and at 38 he was too old to start over somewhere else without taking a significant step backward. The titanium briefcase in his hands contained the remnants of his professional reputation. Hard drives full of financial models that now meant nothing, contracts that would never be signed, and the resignation letter he'd written but hadn't decided whether to submit. The case itself had been a gift from his father when he graduated from Wharton, engraved with his initials and a quote about success being 90% preparation. Right now it felt more like a millstone than a symbol of achievement. Trevor was struggling with the overhead bin above row 14 because someone had jammed an oversized duffel bag into the space at an angle that left barely enough room for a laptop case, let alone his substantial briefcase. He was already frustrated from dealing with gate agents who couldn't upgrade him to first class, despite his platinum status, and the passenger in 14A wasn't making things easier by refusing to lean forward and give him more room to maneuver. He glanced down at her with the kind of casual dismissal that came naturally to someone who spent his days treating people as either assets or obstacles. Young black woman, probably mid-20s, wearing clothes that screamed student budget hood up like she was trying to hide from something. Definitely not someone whose comfort he needed to prioritize. "Excuse me," he said, his tone carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't really a request. "I need you to lean forward so I can get this up here." Amelia looked up from her medical journal, fatigue making her movements slow and deliberate. She had been hoping to review the latest research on pediatric cardiac anomalies during the flight, but the post-surgical exhaustion was making it hard to focus on anything more complex than basic breathing. "Sorry," she mumbled, shifting forward slightly in her seat. It wasn't enough. Trevor needed more room, and his patience was already worn thin by a day of professional humiliation. He hefted the briefcase higher, using more force than finesse, trying to ram it into a space that was clearly too small. The laws of physics, however, don't bend for hedge fund managers, no matter how expensive their suits. The briefcase slipped from his grip like a 40-pound missile, its titanium corner catching the overhead bin's edge and changing trajectory with devastating precision. Time seemed to slow as the case swung down in a perfect arc, its reinforced corner striking Amelia directly on her left temple with the kind of impact that makes a sound you never forget. The crack echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, sharp and final. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman 3 rows up gasped audibly. Even the flight attendants froze, their practiced smiles faltering as they tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Amelia felt the impact as a white-hot explosion of pain that seemed to originate behind her left eye and radiate through her entire skull. Her vision flickered, and for a moment she thought she might lose consciousness right there in her seat. Training kicked in the years of medical education that had taught her to assess trauma even when she was the patient. Blunt force trauma to the temporal region, potential orbital fracture, possible subdural hematoma. The clinical assessment ran through her mind automatically even as warm blood began to trickle down her cheek from where the impact had split the skin near her eyebrow. She pressed her hand to the wound, feeling the steady pulse of blood that indicated the cut was deeper than it initially appeared. Trevor, meanwhile, was focused entirely on his briefcase, catching it on the rebound, and cursing under his breath about the scuff marks on what had been pristine titanium. "Damn it," he muttered, examining the case for damage. "That's going to cost a fortune to get buffed out." It took him several seconds to register that the woman in 14A was bleeding. When he finally looked at her, his first instinct wasn't concern but irritation. This was exactly the kind of complication he didn't need right now, the kind of thing that could turn a simple flight into a legal nightmare if she decided to make a federal case out of what was clearly an accident. "Look, it barely touched you," he said, his tone suggesting that she was overreacting to a minor bump. "These things happen. I'll buy you a drink when we get in the air, okay?" Amelia stared at him in disbelief, her hand still pressed against the bleeding wound. The casual dismissal of what was potentially a serious head injury triggered something deeper than anger. This wasn't just about medical protocol or passenger safety. This was about being seen as human enough to deserve basic concern when you were hurt. "I need medical attention," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her skull. This could be a serious injury. Trevor's expression shifted to something between annoyance and calculation. He was weighing the options, acknowledge potential liability, or minimize the incident before it became a problem. His lawyer brain kicked in the same instincts that had made him successful in business, but had probably contributed to the end of his marriage. "It was an accident," he said, firmly settling into 15A and pulling out his phone like the conversation was over. "Accidents happen. No need to make a big production out of it." Behind them, other passengers were starting to take notice. An elderly Korean man in 16C was whispering urgently to his wife, pointing at the blood on Amelia's face. A college-age Latina woman across the aisle was half-standing, trying to get a better look at what had happened. The energy in the cabin was shifting from normal pre-flight bustle to something more tense and focused. Monica Chen appeared at the scene with the kind of professional efficiency that comes from years of dealing with passenger incidents. She took in the situation at a glance. Young black woman bleeding from a head wound. Expensive-looking businessman acting defensive, multiple witnesses starting to pay attention. Her internal algorithm for handling problems was already calculating the path of least resistance. "What seems to be the problem here?" Monica asked, her tone carrying the barely concealed impatience of someone who had dealt with this kind of drama before. Amelia looked up at her hope flickering in her eyes despite the pain. "I've been injured by falling luggage. I'm experiencing dizziness, vision problems, and potential signs of concussion. I need medical evaluation before this flight takes off." Monica's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as she processed this information through the filter of her own biases and professional priorities. Young woman, casual clothes, making medical claims that sounded sophisticated but could easily be Googled. The bleeding was real, but head wounds always looked worse than they were. More importantly, any medical emergency would mean delays paperwork and potentially having to deplane passengers. "It looks like just a small cut, honey," Monica said, reaching into her service cart for a packet of napkins. "Head wounds bleed a lot, but it's usually not as serious as it looks. Here, put some pressure on it and we'll get you some ice once we're in the air." The dismissal was polite but final, delivered with the kind of patronizing tone that made it clear Monica had already categorized this as a minor incident being blown out of proportion by an inexperienced passenger. She turned to Trevor with a conspiratorial smile that suggested they were both reasonable adults dealing with unnecessary drama. "Sir, I'm sorry about the inconvenience. These things happen sometimes. If you could just secure your bag, we'll be ready for departure." Trevor nodded gratefully, relieved to have an ally in minimizing what he was already thinking of as a non-incident. But as he shoved his briefcase into the overhead bin and slammed the compartment shut, he failed to notice that Amelia was displaying classic signs of a serious head injury, or that his dismissive attitude was being recorded by at least 3 different smartphones, or that the woman whose life he had just endangered was exactly the kind of person who could turn his worst professional day into something infinitely worse. The first wave of nausea hit Amelia as the plane began taxiing away from the gate, a rolling sensation in her stomach that she recognized as a potential symptom of increased intracranial pressure. She had seen enough head trauma cases to know that what seemed like minor symptoms on the ground could become life-threatening emergencies at altitude when changes in cabin pressure could turn a small brain bleed into a catastrophic medical crisis. She tried to focus on the safety demonstration using the routine announcements as an anchor point, while her medical training ran through the differential diagnosis of her own condition. The impact had been significant enough to cause immediate pain and bleeding, which suggested possible orbital fracture or temporal bone damage. More concerning was the way her left field of vision seemed slightly dimmed, and the fact that bright lights now felt like ice picks driving into her brain. "Excuse me?" she called to Monica, who was securing the galley for takeoff. "I need to speak with you about my symptoms." Monica turned with the kind of smile that flight attendants deploy when they're trying to manage difficult passengers without creating a scene. She had already mentally filed the incident under handled and wasn't interested in revisiting it, especially not with a cabin full of passengers watching to see how she'd respond. "Miss, we've already discussed this," Monica said, her voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone within earshot who was in charge. "You have a small cut that's been treated. We'll be happy to get you additional first aid supplies once we're airborne, but right now I need everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened." Amelia felt a surge of frustration that had nothing to do with her injury and everything to do with being dismissed without being heard. This was a pattern she'd encountered throughout her medical career, the assumption that a young black woman couldn't possibly know what she was talking about even when she was literally trying to save her own life. "I'm a doctor," she said, her voice carrying more authority now. "I'm telling you that I'm showing symptoms of a potential subdural hematoma. If this aircraft reaches altitude and cabin pressure changes, while I have active brain bleeding, I could die." The word doctor seemed to hang in the air for a moment, creating a brief pause in the normal pre-flight routine. Several passengers turned to look at the young woman in the MIT sweatshirt, trying to reconcile her appearance with her claim of medical expertise. Monica's expression shifted slightly, but not in the direction of increased concern. Instead, she leaned in closer and lowered her voice, speaking with the kind of patronizing patience usually reserved for children or people having emotional breakdowns. "Honey, I understand you might be scared about flying, and sometimes when people are anxious, they convince themselves that minor injuries are more serious than they really are. But I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I can tell you that what you have is a small cut that needs a bandage, not an emergency medical diversion. The dismissal was complete and public delivered in a tone that suggested Amelia was either lying about her credentials or too emotional to think clearly about her own condition. Behind them, Trevor Walsh nodded approvingly, grateful that the flight crew was handling the situation with appropriate skepticism. But other passengers were starting to pay closer attention, and not all of them were buying Monica's assessment. Jessica Torres, a pre-med student at UCLA who was heading home for her grandmother's birthday, had been watching the interaction with growing concern. She'd spent enough time in hospitals to recognize the signs of head trauma, and everything about the injured woman's demeanor suggested someone with genuine medical knowledge. Ma'am Jessica called out from across the aisle, "Maybe we should listen to her. She really does seem like she knows what she's talking about." Monica's smile became more strained as she realized that other passengers were starting to involve themselves in what should have been a contained situation. This was exactly the kind of thing that could spiral out of control if not managed properly, the kind of incident that could end up in corporate incident reports and customer service complaints. "I appreciate everyone's concern," Monica announced to the cabin, her voice pitched to carry authority, "but we have qualified crew members who are trained to handle medical situations. We've assessed the passenger, and she's cleared to fly." 3 rows back, Martha and Robert Kim were having a whispered conversation in Korean. Martha had been a registered nurse for 35 years before retiring, and she'd seen enough head injuries to know that this young woman was displaying classic signs of serious trauma. The way she was holding her head, the slight confusion in her responses, the obvious pain when she moved too quickly, these weren't the behaviors of someone seeking attention. "Robert," she whispered urgently, "we need to do something. That girl is really hurt." Robert nodded and quietly began recording the interaction on his smartphone, his instincts as a retired civil rights lawyer kicking in. He'd seen too many situations where authority figures made decisions based on assumptions rather than facts, and he had a feeling this was going to be one of those incidents that people would need evidence to believe. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Blake Harrison was reviewing his departure clearance and checking weather updates for the flight path. The 12-minute delay was still eating at him, but he was confident they could make up time once they reached cruising altitude. His performance metrics for the quarter were strong, and a smooth on-time arrival in Los Angeles would put him well within the parameters for his quarterly bonus. He was completely unaware that 3 rows behind him, a renowned pediatric surgeon was developing symptoms that could kill her if the aircraft reached its planned cruising altitude. In his world, cabin management was the flight attendant's responsibility, and unless someone specifically brought a medical emergency to his attention, he had no reason to concern himself with passenger complaints. The intercom crackled to life with his voice smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrison. We've been cleared for takeoff and expect to be wheels up in about 5 minutes. Flight time to Los Angeles is 5 hours and 47 minutes, and we're showing smooth air for most of the journey. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." As the plane turned onto the runway, Amelia felt the acceleration press her back into her seat, and with it came another wave of symptoms that confirmed her worst fears. The pressure changes were already beginning to affect her, and they weren't even airborne yet. She had maybe 10 more minutes before the cabin altitude reached the point where any bleeding in her brain would expand beyond her body's ability to compensate. She unbuckled her seatbelt and started to stand, ignoring the sharp command from Monica to remain seated. This wasn't about following rules anymore. This was about survival. "I am declaring a medical emergency," she called out, her voice cutting through the engine noise. "This aircraft cannot safely take off with my current condition." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly every eye in the cabin was focused on the young woman standing in the aisle, blood still visible on her temple, making a claim that would either save her life or destroy her credibility forever. The Boeing 737 came to an abrupt halt on the taxiway, its engines winding down from takeoff power to idle with a mechanical whine that seemed to echo the tension now filling the cabin. Captain Blake Harrison's voice cut through the intercom with barely contained irritation, the kind of tone that made it clear someone was about to have a very bad day. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be holding our position for a few minutes while we address a passenger issue. I apologize for the inconvenience." The announcement was deliberately vague, but every person on that aircraft knew it was about the young black woman standing defiantly in the aisle, one hand pressed to her bleeding temple, the other gripping the seat back for support. Monica Chen was already moving toward her with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested this situation was about to be resolved whether Amelia cooperated or not. "Miss, you need to sit down immediately," Monica commanded, her professional facade beginning to crack under the pressure of having her authority challenged in front of a full cabin. "You are violating federal aviation regulations by standing during taxi operations." Amelia met her gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she'd built during years of being the youngest, often the only woman, and frequently the only person of color in operating rooms where lives hung in the balance. This wasn't the first time she'd had to fight to be heard, but it might be the most important. "I am a physician, and I am telling you that I am experiencing a medical emergency that could be fatal at altitude," she said, her voice carrying the kind of clinical authority that comes from years of making life-and-death decisions. "I am requesting immediate medical evaluation and possible aircraft diversion." The word physician seemed to ripple through the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. Jessica Torres leaned forward in her seat, her pre-med training making her acutely aware that everything about Amelia's demeanor suggested genuine medical knowledge, rather than passenger hysteria. Martha Kim was nodding approvingly, her nursing background confirming what her eyes were telling her about the severity of the young woman's condition. But Monica's response revealed the depth of her skepticism about claims that didn't fit her preconceptions about who could be a doctor. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification if you're claiming to be a medical professional. Anyone can say they're a doctor when they want special treatment." The request for credentials was delivered with enough condescension to make several passengers wince, but Amelia reached into her backpack without hesitation. Her hospital ID badge caught the cabin lights as she held it up, clearly showing her photo alongside the words, "Dr. Amelia Richardson, Chief of Pediatric Cardiac Surgery, Massachusetts General Hospital." Jessica Torres gasped audibly from across the aisle. "Oh my God. You're the surgeon who saved those conjoined twins. I read about your case in the New England Journal of Medicine." The recognition seemed to shift something in the cabin's atmosphere, but Monica's expression hardened rather than softened. In her experience, the bigger the claim, the more likely it was to be fraudulent, and she'd seen plenty of fake identification in her 15 years of dealing with passenger incidents. "ID cards can be purchased online," Monica said dismissively, though several passengers were now pulling out their phones to verify Jessica's claim. "What I see is a passenger who got a minor cut and is now disrupting an entire flight with medical claims that conveniently developed after we started taxiing." The accusation of fraud hung in the air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and dangerous. Robert Kim, who had been quietly recording the exchange, felt his civil rights lawyer instincts kick into high gear. He'd seen this playbook before authority figures dismissing credible claims from people of color by questioning their competence, their honesty, or their right to be in spaces where they demanded respect. "Excuse me," Robert called out, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "I'm recording this interaction, and I think everyone should know that this woman's credentials are easily verifiable. If she says she's a surgeon experiencing a medical emergency, maybe we should listen to her instead of debating whether she's lying about her profession." Martha Kim stood up in her seat, her Korean accent becoming more pronounced as her anger grew. "I am a retired nurse with 35 years' experience. This woman shows all signs of serious head trauma. You are making terrible mistake by not listening to her." The cabin was beginning to divide into factions, with some passengers clearly supporting Amelia's medical claims, while others seemed to side with the flight crew's authority. Trevor Walsh, who had been hoping the incident would fade into obscurity, realized with growing dread that his briefcase accident was becoming the center of a major confrontation. "Look," he interjected, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. "I'm the one whose bag fell, and I'm telling you it was barely a tap. She's obviously trying to make a big deal out of nothing, probably looking for a lawsuit payout." His words seemed to crystallize something for Monica, who nodded as if Trevor had provided the missing piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve. Here was a successful-looking businessman confirming what she'd suspected all along. This was a fabricated emergency designed to extract compensation from the airline. "Sir, thank you for providing that context," Monica said, turning back to Amelia with renewed conviction. "Now I need you to sit down immediately, or we'll have to involve airport security." But Amelia wasn't backing down. If anything, the dismissal of her medical expertise seemed to strengthen her resolve. She'd spent too many years fighting to be respected in a profession dominated by men who looked like Captain Harrison and Trevor Walsh to surrender her credibility now, especially when her life might literally depend on being heard. "My vision is deteriorating. I'm experiencing photophobia, and I have clear signs of increased intracranial pressure," she said, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone in the cabin could hear her medical assessment. "If this aircraft reaches altitude and my condition worsens, I could have a brain herniation. That means death or permanent disability. Are you willing to accept responsibility for that outcome?" The clinical precision of her language was having an effect on passengers who might not have understood the medical terminology but could recognize the sound of genuine expertise. Even some of those who had initially sided with the crew were beginning to look uncertain, especially as they observed Amelia's obvious symptoms and compared them to her detailed medical knowledge. Monica, however, was committed to her course of action. In her mind, backing down now would undermine her authority for the rest of the flight and set a precedent that any passenger with an internet connection could ground an aircraft by claiming medical expertise. "Ma'am, we have protocol for handling medical emergencies, and what you're describing doesn't meet the threshold for aircraft diversion," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a manual. "You are conscious, alert, and able to communicate clearly. You're cleared to fly." The cabin door suddenly opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Captain Blake Harrison emerged from the cockpit with the kind of controlled fury that comes from having carefully laid plans disrupted by what he assumed was passenger drama. At 6'2" with broad shoulders filling his uniform, he commanded immediate attention as he strode down the aisle toward the commotion. Blake had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, and in his experience, passenger medical emergencies fell into two categories: genuine crises that required immediate action and attention-seeking behavior that could be managed with firm authority. Looking at the young woman standing in the aisle, he was confident this fell into the second category. The bleeding had mostly stopped. She was standing without assistance, and her speech was clear and coherent. More importantly, his first officer had just informed him that they were now 23 minutes behind schedule with air traffic control, warning that further delays could push them into a holding pattern that would cost them an additional hour of flight time. "What exactly is the problem here?" Blake asked, his voice pitched to carry authority throughout the cabin. He wanted every passenger to understand that he was the one making decisions, and that those decisions would be based on aviation expertise rather than passenger anxiety. Amelia turned to face him, and for a moment the two locked eyes across a chasm of assumptions and misunderstandings that neither of them fully recognized. She saw a white male authority figure who had already dismissed her concerns without evaluation. He saw a young black woman in casual clothes who was disrupting his flight schedule with what appeared to be exaggerated medical claims. "Captain, I am Dr. Amelia Richardson, and I am experiencing symptoms of traumatic brain injury that could be fatal at altitude," she said, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her skull. "I am requesting that this aircraft return to the gate for immediate medical evaluation." Blake's expression didn't change as he processed her request, but internally he was running through the calculations that would determine his response. A medical diversion would cost the airline tens of thousands of dollars, destroy his on-time performance metrics, and potentially result in passenger compensation claims that could reach 6 figures. Against that, he weighed what appeared to be a minor injury being inflated by someone who might be seeking financial compensation. "Miss," he said deliberately, using the diminutive title despite her medical credentials. "I've been flying for over 2 decades, and I can tell you that if you were experiencing a true medical emergency, you wouldn't be standing here arguing with my crew. You'd be unconscious or worse." The dismissal was complete, delivered with the kind of certainty that brooked no argument. But as Blake turned to head back to the cockpit, confident that his authority had resolved the situation, he failed to notice that Amelia was pulling out her smartphone and opening an app that would change everything. The soft chime of Jessica Torres's iPhone seemed unusually loud in the tense cabin as she pulled up the search results that would transform everyone's understanding of exactly who they were dealing with. Her fingers had been flying across the screen since Amelia first mentioned her name, and what she'd found made her hands shake as she scrolled through article after article. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, then louder. "Everyone needs to hear this." She stood up in her seat, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that comes from discovering something that changes everything. Dr. Amelia Richardson isn't just any surgeon. She's the pediatric cardiac surgeon who just performed the most complex separation surgery in medical history. She literally saved conjoined twins yesterday after a 28-hour operation. The words seemed to hang in the air as passengers around her began pulling out their own devices, frantically searching for confirmation of what Jessica was telling them. Robert Kim, still recording everything on his phone, felt his stomach drop as he realized they were witnessing something far worse than routine airline customer service failures. Here, Jessica continued reading from her phone Boston Globe yesterday's headline, "Medical Miracle at Mass General Local Surgeon Separates Conjoined Twins in Marathon Operation." There's a photo of her in surgical scrubs, same face, same scar near her eye. Martha Kim was nodding vigorously, her nursing background making her painfully aware of how serious this situation had become. "This woman performs surgery on babies' hearts." She called out, her accent thick with emotion. "She knows about head trauma better than anyone on this plane." The revelation seemed to ripple through the cabin like electricity, passenger after passenger looking up from their phones with expressions of shock and growing anger. Monica Chen, who had been so confident in her assessment of the situation, felt the first flutter of doubt in her chest as she realized that her dismissive treatment of a problem passenger might have been directed at one of the country's most respected surgeons. Trevor Walsh, meanwhile, was having what could only be described as an out-of-body experience, as he fully grasped the magnitude of what his titanium briefcase had done. The woman whose medical concerns he'd dismissed as lawsuit-seeking wasn't some random passenger looking for a payday. She was a surgeon whose hands were literally insured for millions of dollars, whose expertise was so rare that she was probably irreplaceable. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, pulling out his own phone to confirm what Jessica was saying. The search results were overwhelming pages of articles about groundbreaking surgeries, medical awards, humanitarian work in developing countries. This wasn't just a doctor. This was someone who appeared on medical journal covers and gave keynote speeches at international conferences. Captain Blake Harrison, who had returned to the cockpit confident that he'd handled the situation appropriately, was beginning to sense a shift in the cabin's energy through the thin cockpit door. The conversations he could overhear were taking on a different tone, more urgent and less supportive of his crew's decisions. His first officer, David Park, was monitoring the company frequency when an unusual message came through the radio. "Captain, we're getting a call from operations. They're saying something about verifying a passenger's medical credentials." Blake felt the first cold finger of concern touch his spine as he took the radio. "Operations, this is Harrison. What's the nature of your inquiry?" The voice that came back through the radio was tight with controlled urgency. Captain Harrison, we've received multiple calls about a passenger named Dr. Amelia Richardson. We need confirmation of her status and any medical incident aboard your aircraft. Blake's mouth went dry as he realized that word of the incident was somehow reaching the outside world. Operations. We have a passenger who sustained a minor injury and is claiming medical emergency status. The situation has been assessed and resolved. There was a pause on the radio, the kind of silence that usually preceded very bad news. Captain, we're showing Dr. Richardson as a verified medical professional with federal emergency credentials. If she's claiming medical emergency status, we need immediate confirmation of her condition and your response protocol. The words federal emergency credentials hit Blake like a physical blow. In 22 years of flying, he'd encountered federal air marshals, government officials, and even celebrities with security details, but he'd never heard of a passenger having federal medical status. The implications were beginning to dawn on him, and they were catastrophic. Back in the cabin, Amelia was opening the medical emergency app on her phone with fingers that were starting to tremble slightly. The app was connected to the Federal Medical Emergency Network, a protocol developed after 9/11 to ensure that critical medical personnel could be located and protected during national emergencies. As one of only 12 pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country qualified to perform the type of complex procedures she specialized in, Amelia held a federal designation as a critical medical asset. The app's interface was simple, a red button that would immediately alert federal authorities that a designated medical professional was incapacitated or under duress. She'd never used it before, had hoped she'd never need to. But the combination of her worsening symptoms and the crew's complete dismissal of her medical expertise left her no choice. She pressed the button. Immediately, the app began transmitting her GPS coordinates, medical status, and emergency code to a network that included the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Centers for Disease Control. Within 60 seconds, her mentor and former department chief, Dr. Michael Thompson, was receiving an automated alert that one of his most accomplished former residents was signaling a medical emergency. Dr. Thompson, who was currently serving as an advisor to the Surgeon General's emergency response team, didn't hesitate. He immediately contacted the FAA's Emergency Operations Center, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from 4 decades of saving lives and training the surgeons who would save the next generation. This is Dr. Michael Thompson calling regarding a federal medical emergency alert. Dr. Amelia Richardson has triggered her emergency protocol, and I need immediate contact with her current aircraft. The FAA Operations Center erupted into activity as the implications of Thompson's call became clear. A federally designated critical medical asset was signaling distress aboard a commercial aircraft, and if anything happened to her due to crew negligence, the regulatory and legal consequences would be unprecedented. In the cabin, passengers were now openly staring at Amelia with a mixture of awe and horror as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't just about one passenger's medical emergency. This was about the potential loss of someone whose expertise was literally irreplaceable, whose surgical skills represented decades of training and experience that couldn't be quickly reproduced. Monica Chen was standing frozen in the aisle, her 15 years of experience providing no guidance for a situation where she'd potentially endangered the life of someone who appeared on magazine covers and was quoted in medical textbooks. Every instinct told her to continue defending her decisions, but the evidence mounting around her was becoming impossible to ignore. The cabin's intercom crackled to life, but this time it wasn't Captain Harrison's voice. It was the unmistakable tone of air traffic control broadcasting on the cabin address system with an urgency that made every passenger sit up straighter. Delta Flight 847. This is Boston Control. You are ordered to return to Gate B12 immediately. Emergency medical response is standing by. Do not attempt takeoff until federal medical evaluation is complete. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of engines spooling down and the hydraulic whine of an aircraft returning to the gate under circumstances no one aboard would ever forget. The Boeing 737 was barely halfway back to the gate when Captain Blake Harrison's radio exploded with a flurry of communications that made his blood run cold. The voice coming through his headset wasn't the routine professionalism he was used to from air traffic control. It was clipped urgent and carrying the kind of authority that suggested his career might be ending in real time. Delta 847, this is Boston Control. Be advised you have federal agents and emergency medical personnel responding to your aircraft. Maintain current heading and prepare for immediate passenger medical evaluation upon arrival at gate. Blake's hands were actually shaking as he responded, his voice cracking slightly on the first word. Boston Control, can you clarify the nature of the federal response? We have a passenger medical situation that appeared to be resolved. The pause before the response lasted just long enough for Blake to understand that his assessment of the situation had been catastrophically wrong. Captain Harrison, your passenger Dr. Amelia Richardson is a federally designated critical medical asset. Her emergency alert has triggered protocols involving multiple federal agencies. Prepare for immediate investigation of your crew's response to her medical emergency. The words federally designated critical medical asset hit Blake like a physical blow. In all his years of training, he'd never heard that phrase before, but the implications were immediately clear. This wasn't just any passenger he'd dismissed. This was someone whose medical expertise was considered so valuable that the federal government had designated her as critical national infrastructure. His first officer, David Park, was staring at him with an expression that mixed horror and disbelief. Captain, what exactly did we just do? Blake couldn't answer because he was still trying to process the magnitude of his error. He'd treated a world-renowned surgeon like a problem passenger, dismissing her medical emergency claims and threatening to have her arrested for trying to save her own life. If she died or suffered permanent injury because of his decisions, he wouldn't just lose his job, he'd probably face federal criminal charges. In the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed from tense confrontation to something approaching shock, as passengers realized they were witnessing a federal incident unfold in real time. Amelia was still standing in the aisle, but her condition was visibly deteriorating. The photophobia she'd mentioned earlier was making it difficult for her to keep her eyes open under the cabin lights, and she was swaying slightly, despite her grip on the seat back. Jessica Torres had moved across the aisle to sit next to her, using her pre-med training to monitor Amelia's condition. Dr. Richardson, can you tell me what you're experiencing right now? Amelia's response came slowly, as if she was having to work harder to form the words. Classic signs of increasing intracranial pressure. Headache is worsening, vision is getting cloudier, and I'm starting to feel nauseous. If we had reached altitude... She didn't finish the sentence, but Jessica understood the implications. Martha Kim had moved forward to help, her nursing instincts overriding any concerns about federal regulations or crew authority. Doctor, we keep you still until medical help arrives. You did right thing by stopping plane. The validation from a fellow medical professional seemed to strengthen Amelia slightly, but it was clear that time was becoming a critical factor. Whatever was happening inside her skull was progressing, and every minute that passed without proper medical intervention increased the risk of permanent damage. Monica Chen stood paralyzed in the forward galley, watching her 15-year career implode as she realized the full scope of what she'd done. She'd not only dismissed the medical concerns of a federal asset, she'd done so in front of dozens of witnesses who were now recording everything on their phones. The discrimination lawsuit alone would probably end her career. But if Dr. Richardson suffered permanent injury, Monica could face criminal charges. Trevor Walsh was experiencing his own version of hell as he fully grasped that his worst day had just become exponentially worse. Not only had he physically injured one of the country's most respected surgeons, but he then dismissed her concerns and accused her of seeking financial compensation. His hedge fund career was definitely over, but now he was looking at potential assault charges against a federal asset. The gate came into view through the cabin windows, and passengers could see the response that had been marshaled in the 20 minutes since Amelia's emergency alert. There were at least 6 emergency vehicles surrounding the gate area, including 2 ambulances, 3 federal law enforcement vehicles, and what appeared to be a mobile command unit. Robert Kim, still recording everything, provided a running commentary for his video. We're seeing what appears to be the largest emergency response I've ever witnessed for a single passenger medical incident. The woman who the crew dismissed as seeking attention is apparently someone the federal government considers essential personnel. As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, the cabin door opened immediately, but instead of normal ground crew, federal agents and FBI windbreakers boarded the aircraft. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with the kind of presence that made it immediately clear she was in charge of whatever was about to happen. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI," she announced to the cabin. "We're responding to a federal medical emergency. I need everyone to remain seated while we assess the situation." Behind her came a team of emergency medical technicians led by Dr. Patricia Singh, a neurological specialist who had been helicoptered in from Boston Medical Center the moment Dr. Thompson's call reached the appropriate authorities. Dr. Singh moved directly to Amelia with the kind of focused intensity that comes from years of handling life-threatening emergencies. "Dr. Richardson, I'm Patricia Singh, Neurology. Can you tell me your current symptoms?" Amelia's response was noticeably slower than it had been even 10 minutes earlier. Increasing intracranial pressure, photophobia, nausea, left-sided visual field defects. Mechanism was blunt force trauma to left temporal region approximately 45 minutes ago. Dr. Singh was already conducting a rapid neurological assessment, shining a penlight into Amelia's eyes and checking her pupil responses. What she saw made her immediately reach for her radio. "This is Dr. Singh on scene. I need immediate transport to Mass General Trauma Bay. Patient is showing signs of evolving subdural hematoma with evidence of increasing ICP. This is time critical." The medical terminology meant nothing to most passengers, but the urgency in Dr. Singh's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a minor injury that had been blown out of proportion. This was exactly the kind of life-threatening emergency that Amelia had been trying to warn them about. Special Agent Martinez was conducting her own assessment, but her focus was on the crew and passengers who had been involved in the incident. "I need to speak with the flight crew who made the decision to dismiss Dr. Richardson's medical concerns, and I need to identify the passenger responsible for the initial injury." Monica Chen stepped forward with the expression of someone walking to her own execution. "I'm the senior flight attendant who handled the medical situation." Trevor Walsh raised his hand with obvious reluctance. "The briefcase that fell was mine." Agent Martinez looked at them both with the kind of expression that suggested their immediate future was going to be very unpleasant. "You'll both need to accompany us for questioning regarding your handling of a federal medical emergency." As the EMTs prepared to transport Amelia, she looked back at the passengers who had supported her when the crew wouldn't listen. Her voice was weak but clear as she spoke to Jessica Torres, Martha Kim, and Robert Kim. "Thank you for believing me when no one else would. Sometimes being heard is the difference between life and death." The words carried weight that went far beyond the immediate medical crisis, touching on something deeper about respect bias and the consequences of assumptions. As they wheeled her off the aircraft toward the waiting ambulance, every person in that cabin understood they had just witnessed something that would change lives forever. The trauma bay at Massachusetts General Hospital erupted into controlled chaos the moment Dr. Amelia Richardson's ambulance pulled into the emergency dock. Word of her condition had spread through the hospital like wildfire, and every surgeon who had ever worked with her, learned from her, or been inspired by her reputation was waiting to help save the life of someone who had saved countless others. Dr. Patricia Singh's assessment during transport had confirmed everyone's worst fears. Amelia was showing clear signs of a subdural hematoma with rapidly increasing intracranial pressure, exactly the condition she had been trying to warn the flight crew about. The fact that she had remained conscious and coherent enough to diagnose her own potentially fatal injury spoke to both her medical expertise and her extraordinary mental strength under pressure. "Get me a CT stat," Dr. Singh called out as they wheeled Amelia into Trauma Bay 3. "And someone call Dr. Thompson. He's going to want to personally oversee this case." The CT scan results appeared on the monitors within minutes, and the images told a story that made even experienced trauma surgeons wince. A significant collection of blood was pressing against Amelia's brain tissue, and the measurements showed that she was approaching the point where surgical intervention would become a matter of minutes rather than hours. Dr. Michael Thompson arrived at the hospital via emergency helicopter, his status as advisor to the Surgeon General having cleared every bureaucratic hurdle between him and his former resident. At 68, Thompson was a legend in pediatric surgery, but seeing Amelia on the trauma table brought back memories of every young surgeon he'd mentored, and every case where timing had meant the difference between success and tragedy. "What's our window?" Thompson asked Dr. Singh, studying the scans with the kind of intensity that had made him one of the most respected surgeons in the country. "She's got maybe 30 minutes before we start seeing brainstem compression," Singh replied. "If that aircraft had reached cruising altitude, the pressure changes would have accelerated this process significantly. She'd probably be dead by now." The implications of that statement hung in the air as both doctors realized that Amelia's insistence on grounding the aircraft hadn't just saved her life. It had probably prevented a medical emergency at 35,000 feet that would have been impossible to treat and would have traumatized every passenger aboard. Meanwhile, back at Logan Airport, the investigation into the incident was proceeding with the kind of federal urgency typically reserved for national security threats. Captain Blake Harrison sat in a conference room with FBI agents and FAA investigators, his pilot's uniform looking increasingly out of place as the full scope of his professional misconduct became clear. Special Agent Martinez reviewed her notes with the methodical precision of someone who had conducted hundreds of these interviews. "Captain Harrison, let me make sure I understand your decision-making process." "Doctor, Richardson informed you that she was experiencing symptoms of potential brain bleeding that could be fatal at altitude. She provided medical credentials confirming her expertise, and multiple passengers supported her assessment. Despite all of this, you chose to continue with takeoff preparations." Blake's lawyer, hastily summoned from a downtown firm, placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Blake felt compelled to explain his reasoning. "Agent Martinez, I've been flying for 22 years. I've seen passengers fake medical emergencies for upgrades, compensation, or just attention. Nothing about this situation initially appeared to warrant a medical diversion. Nothing about the situation Martinez asked her tone, suggesting she found his answer inadequate. Not the visible head injury, not her detailed medical knowledge, not the supporting testimony from other passengers with medical backgrounds. Blake's silence spoke volumes, and his lawyer finally intervened. My client exercised his judgment as pilot in command based on the information available to him at the time." Martinez nodded as if she'd expected that response. "Captain Harrison, are you familiar with federal statutes regarding interference with critical infrastructure? Dr. Richardson holds federal emergency medical credentials specifically because her surgical expertise is considered irreplaceable. Your decision to dismiss her medical emergency endangered not just her life, but potentially the lives of every patient she might have treated in the future." The weight of that responsibility seemed to settle on Blake's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd been thinking about on-time performance metrics and quarterly bonuses while potentially condemning to death someone whose hands could save children that no other surgeon could help. In a separate interview room, Monica Chen was facing her own reckoning with federal investigators and airline corporate representatives. Her union representative sat beside her, but offered little comfort as the scope of her professional failure became apparent. Ms. Chen, the FAA investigator, began airline protocol. Clearly states that any passenger claiming medical expertise should be taken seriously, especially when they're describing potentially life-threatening conditions. Why did you choose to dismiss Dr. Richardson's concerns? Monica's answer came out as barely a whisper. She looked so young and her clothes were casual. I thought she was trying to delay the flight for attention or compensation. The honesty of her response only made it worse, revealing the depth of bias that had informed her decisions. She'd essentially admitted that she'd judged a world-renowned surgeon's credibility based on her appearance rather than her credentials or medical knowledge. Trevor Walsh's interview was taking place simultaneously in another room where his expensive lawyer was having difficulty explaining how his client's negligence had endangered a federal asset. The briefcase incident might have been accidental, but Trevor's subsequent dismissal of Amelia's concerns and his suggestions that she was seeking financial compensation had demonstrated a level of callousness that prosecutors would find easy to present to a jury. Mr. Walsh, the federal prosecutor, explained assault on a federal asset carries enhanced penalties under federal law. Combined with your public statements dismissing Dr. Richardson's medical concerns, we're looking at charges that could result in significant prison time. Trevor's world of hedge fund mergers and acquisition deals hadn't prepared him for the reality that his worst professional day had now become a potential felony case. The briefcase that had once represented his career aspirations was now evidence in a federal investigation. Back at the hospital, the surgical team was preparing for what would be one of the most closely watched medical procedures in the hospital's history. Not only was the patient one of their own, but the successful treatment of her injuries would validate every warning she'd tried to give about the potential consequences of medical negligence. Dr. Thompson scrubbed in personally, despite having retired from active surgery 3 years earlier. This wasn't just about saving Amelia's life. This was about ensuring that the surgeon who had revolutionized pediatric cardiac care would be able to continue her work. She diagnosed her own subdural hematoma and predicted the progression of her symptoms with perfect accuracy, Thompson told the assembled surgical team. We're not just treating a colleague here. We're treating someone whose medical knowledge probably saved her own life. The operation proceeded with textbook precision. The accumulated expertise of decades of surgical training focused on removing the blood clot that threatened to destroy one of medicine's brightest minds. As they worked, news of the incident was beginning to spread through medical communities nationwide, with colleagues and former patients following updates on social media. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved that the same hands that had separated conjoined twins were now being operated on, because an airline crew had dismissed their owner's medical expertise. It was a stark reminder of how bias and assumptions could endanger even the most accomplished individuals when they didn't fit stereotypical expectations. 3 hours after the surgery began, Dr. Thompson emerged from the operating room with the kind of exhausted satisfaction that comes from winning a battle against impossible odds. The procedure had been successful, the pressure had been relieved, and while Amelia would face a lengthy recovery, her cognitive functions and surgical abilities appeared to be intact. The news of her successful surgery spread as quickly as word of the original incident. But for Captain Harrison, Monica Chen, and Trevor Walsh, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that their own reckonings were just beginning. The surgical suite fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors as Dr. Thompson made the final sutures closing the incision that had quite literally saved Amelia's life. The subdural hematoma had been successfully evacuated, and the pressure readings showed that her intracranial pressure was returning to normal levels for the first time since Trevor Walsh's briefcase had struck her temple hours earlier. Pressures stabilizing at 15, the anesthesiologist reported relief evident in his voice. "All vitals are strong. She's going to make it." The collective exhale from the surgical team seemed to echo through the operating room as nurses and residents who had been holding their breath finally allowed themselves to believe that one of the hospital's most gifted surgeons would survive to operate another day. But beyond the immediate relief of successful surgery lay the sobering reality of how close they had come to losing someone irreplaceable. Dr. Thompson stepped back from the table, pulling off his surgical gloves with the measured movements of someone processing both triumph and rage. In his 40-year career, he'd seen medical negligence, but he'd never encountered a case where bias and assumptions had so nearly resulted in the death of a colleague whose expertise was literally irreplaceable. If that aircraft had reached cruising altitude, he said quietly to the assembled team, the pressure changes would have accelerated the bleeding beyond our ability to intervene. She would have died at 35,000 feet, and there would have been nothing anyone could do to save her. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. Everyone present understood that they weren't just looking at a successful surgery. They were looking at the aftermath of a near catastrophe that had been prevented only by Amelia's own medical knowledge and her refusal to accept dismissal of her concerns. Meanwhile, in the recovery room where Amelia would spend the next several hours regaining consciousness, federal investigators were piecing together a timeline that revealed the full scope of the institutional failures that had nearly cost her life. The investigation had expanded beyond the immediate incident to include a broader examination of airline policies regarding medical emergencies and passenger treatment. Agent Martinez was reviewing passenger statements when a pattern began to emerge that went beyond simple negligence or bad judgment. Multiple witnesses described crew behavior that suggested bias had played a significant role in the dismissal of Amelia's medical concerns, from Monica Chen's immediate assumption that a young black woman was seeking attention to Captain Harrison's refusal to consider that someone in casual clothes could be a medical professional. This wasn't just poor decision-making, Martinez told her supervisor via encrypted phone. This appears to be a clear case of discrimination that endangered the life of a federal asset. We're looking at potential civil rights violations on top of the federal interference charges. The legal implications were staggering. Not only had the crew endangered Amelia's life through medical negligence, but they had done so in a way that suggested systematic bias against passengers who didn't fit their preconceptions about who deserved to be taken seriously in medical emergencies. Robert Kim's video footage was proving invaluable in documenting the crew's responses and the clear progression of Amelia's symptoms that any trained observer should have recognized as genuine medical distress. The recording captured not just the dismissive words, but the tone and body language that revealed the depth of bias underlying the crew's decisions. Dr. Singh, who had been the first medical professional to properly assess Amelia's condition, was providing expert testimony that would prove crucial in any future legal proceedings. Her assessment confirmed that every symptom Amelia had described was consistent with the subdural hematoma that nearly killed her, and that her medical knowledge had been not only accurate but potentially life-saving. Dr. Richardson's self-diagnosis was textbook perfect, Singh explained to investigators. She recognized the signs of increasing intracranial pressure, understood the risks of altitude exposure, and correctly predicted the progression of her condition. Any medical professional hearing her description should have immediately understood the severity of her situation. The validation of Amelia's medical assessment only made the crew's dismissal more damaging, revealing not just poor judgment but willful disregard for expert medical opinion. It was becoming clear that this case would become a landmark in discussions about bias in emergency medical response and the potentially fatal consequences of assumptions based on appearance rather than credentials. As word of the incident spread through medical communities, colleagues began sharing their own experiences of being dismissed or underestimated based on age, race, or gender. The case was resonating beyond aviation medicine to touch on broader issues of professional respect and the dangerous consequences of unconscious bias in high-stakes situations. Dr. Thompson emerged from the surgical suite to find a gathering of media representatives, hospital administrators, and federal officials waiting for updates. His statement to the press would be brief but devastating in its implications for the airline industry. "Dr. Richardson is stable and expected to make a full recovery," he announced. "However, I want to be absolutely clear that if the flight crew's medical assessment had been allowed to stand, if this aircraft had reached altitude with her condition untreated, we would be planning a funeral instead of celebrating a successful surgery." The bluntness of his statement sent shockwaves through the assembled media, making it clear that this wasn't just a story about airline customer service failures, but about life and death consequences of bias and medical negligence. The visual of one renowned surgeon fighting to save another while the airline crew that had dismissed her concerns faced federal charges created a narrative that would dominate headlines for weeks. As Amelia began her recovery, the broader implications of her case were just beginning to unfold, setting the stage for changes in aviation medicine that would protect future passengers from experiencing the same dismissal of their medical expertise and potentially fatal consequences of bias masquerading as professional judgment. 6 months after the incident that had nearly cost her life, Amelia Richardson walked into the federal courthouse in Boston with the measured gait of someone who had fought her way back from the edge of death and emerged stronger than before. The scar from her emergency surgery was barely visible beneath her carefully styled hair, but the slight tremor in her left hand served as a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing everything because an airline crew couldn't see past their biases. The federal courthouse was packed with media representatives, medical professionals, and aviation industry observers who understood they were witnessing a case that would reshape how airlines handled medical emergencies and passenger treatment. The charges against Captain Blake Harrison, Monica Chen, and Trevor Walsh had been filed under multiple federal statutes from interference with critical infrastructure to civil rights violations, creating a legal precedent that would reverberate through the industry for decades. Blake sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 6 months. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked the week after the incident. His pension had been frozen pending the outcome of civil litigation, and his wife had filed for divorce once the full scope of his professional misconduct became public. The man who had once commanded jumbo jets now faced the possibility of federal prison time for endangering the life of someone whose medical expertise was considered essential to national security. Monica Chen's fate had been sealed even faster than Blake's. Delta had terminated her employment within 48 hours of the incident. Her union had declined to support her defense once the full scope of her bias-driven decisions became clear, and she now worked part-time at a customer service call center, while facing potential criminal charges that could result in years behind bars. Trevor Walsh's situation was perhaps the most complex, as his briefcase accident had been genuinely unintentional, but his subsequent behavior in dismissing Amelia's medical concerns had transformed a simple negligence case into something far more serious. His hedge fund had collapsed within weeks of the incident, clients fleeing, as news coverage revealed his role in nearly killing a renowned surgeon, and his personal assets had been frozen pending civil litigation that threatened to bankrupt him completely. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Santos, had built her case around a simple but devastating premise that bias and assumptions about who deserved to be taken seriously in medical emergencies had nearly resulted in the death of someone whose surgical skills were literally irreplaceable. Her opening statement laid out the stakes with clinical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about what happens when prejudice masquerades as professional judgment." Santos began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications of the case. Dr. Amelia Richardson didn't just survive a medical emergency. She survived being dismissed, disbelieved, and endangered by people who decided that a young black woman in casual clothes couldn't possibly be telling the truth about her own medical condition. The evidence presented over the following weeks painted a devastating picture of institutional bias and medical negligence. Robert Kim's video footage showed the progression of Amelia's symptoms and the crew's dismissive responses with undeniable clarity. Medical experts testified that every symptom she had described was consistent with the life-threatening condition that nearly killed her. Aviation safety specialists explained how the crew's decisions had violated multiple protocols designed to protect passenger safety. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Amelia herself, who took the stand with the same calm authority she brought to the operating room. Her account of the incident was delivered without emotional theatrics, relying instead on medical precision and factual clarity that made the crew's dismissal seem even more inexcusable. I told them I was experiencing symptoms of potential brain bleeding that could be fatal at altitude. Amelia testified, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of reliving the trauma. I provided my medical credentials, explained the physiological risks, and requested immediate evaluation. Their response was to question my credibility, dismiss my expertise, and threaten me with arrest for trying to save my own life. The defense attorneys attempted to portray the incident as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings rather than willful discrimination, but their arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence showing pattern after pattern of bias-driven decision-making. Captain Harrison's attorney tried to argue that his client had been protecting the safety of other passengers by refusing to be manipulated by what appeared to be fraudulent medical claims. But the argument fell flat when prosecutors revealed Harrison's history of complaints from minority passengers who felt their concerns had been dismissed. Monica Chen's defense relied on claims that she had followed standard airline protocols, but internal Delta training documents revealed that she had ignored specific procedures requiring crew members to take any passenger medical claims seriously, especially when made by individuals with apparent medical knowledge. Her dismissal of Amelia's credentials and her assumption that the claims were fraudulent revealed a level of bias that prosecutors characterized as dangerous to public safety. Trevor Walsh's attorney attempted to separate his client from the crew's medical decisions, arguing that his role in the incident had ended when his briefcase accidentally struck Amelia. But recordings of his public statements dismissing her injury as minor and suggesting she was seeking financial compensation revealed a callousness that juries found difficult to excuse, especially when combined with evidence of his history of discriminatory behavior in professional settings. The jury deliberations lasted less than 4 hours, an unusually quick decision in a complex federal case that reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against all 3 defendants. When they returned to the courtroom, the forewoman's voice was clear and unwavering as she delivered guilty verdicts on all major charges. Captain Blake Harrison was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, along with a lifetime ban from commercial aviation and restitution payments that would consume the remainder of his assets. The judge's comments during sentencing revealed the depth of judicial displeasure with his conduct. Captain Harrison, you held the life of a brilliant surgeon in your hands, and you nearly let her die because you couldn't see past your own assumptions about who deserved to be believed. Judge Patricia Williams said her words carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications of the case. Your bias didn't just endanger one passenger, it nearly deprived the world of someone whose medical expertise is irreplaceable. Monica Chen received 8 months in federal prison and was permanently banned from working in commercial aviation. Her sentence was slightly lighter due to her cooperation with investigators, but the judge made clear that her bias-driven decisions had contributed significantly to endangering Amelia's life. Trevor Walsh's sentence reflected both his role in the original injury and his subsequent behavior in dismissing Amelia's medical concerns. He received 6 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay substantial restitution, effectively bankrupting him and ensuring that his hedge fund career was permanently over. But beyond the individual sentences lay the broader implications of the case for the aviation industry. The Federal Aviation Administration announced sweeping changes to medical emergency protocols, requiring all airline crews to receive specialized training in recognizing and responding to passenger medical emergencies without bias. The Richardson Protocol, as it became known, mandated that any passenger claiming medical expertise must be taken seriously regardless of their appearance, and that crew members who dismissed such claims without proper evaluation would face federal penalties. Airlines across the country began implementing new training programs designed to address unconscious bias in emergency response situations. Understanding that the legal and financial consequences of another incident like Amelia's could be catastrophic for their operations and reputation. As Amelia left the courthouse after the sentencing, surrounded by colleagues and supporters who had followed her case from the beginning, she reflected on how the worst day of her life had ultimately led to changes that would protect countless other passengers from experiencing the same dismissal and potential endangerment she had faced. The tremor in her left hand would never fully disappear, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. But as she returned to the operating room where she continued to save lives that others couldn't, she knew that her survival had served a purpose beyond her individual recovery, creating protections that would ensure future passengers wouldn't have to fight for their lives while being dismissed by the very people responsible for their safety. Dr. Amelia Richardson's first day back in the operating room came exactly 4 months and 12 days after her emergency surgery, a timeline she had tracked not with the obsessive precision of someone counting down to freedom, but with the measured patience of a surgeon who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. The tremor in her left hand had improved with physical therapy, though it would never completely disappear, and her surgical skills had returned to their pre-injury level through months of meticulous rehabilitation and practice. The pediatric cardiac surgery unit at Massachusetts General erupted in quiet celebration as Amelia scrubbed in for her first case back a complex arterial switch procedure on a 3-month-old infant with transposition of the great arteries. Her colleagues had maintained respectful distance during her recovery, understanding that she needed space to process not just the physical trauma, but the emotional aftermath of being dismissed and endangered by people who should have protected her. But seeing her back in surgical scrubs reviewing patient charts with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her legendary among pediatric surgeons felt like watching medicine itself heal from a wound that had threatened to damage far more than one individual career. The case proceeded with textbook precision, her steady hands guiding microscopic sutures through cardiac tissue with the kind of skill that reminded everyone present why the federal government had designated her expertise as critical national infrastructure. "It's like she never left," whispered one of the surgical residents to another as they watched Amelia complete the arterial reconstruction. "You'd never know she almost died because some airline crew thought they knew better than one of the best surgeons in the world." The successful surgery was more than just a medical victory. It was a statement that bias and discrimination could wound but not destroy genuine expertise and dedication. As news of her return spread through the hospital, and beyond it, became a symbol of resilience that resonated far beyond the medical community. The broader impact of her case was already reshaping aviation medicine in ways that would have seemed impossible before her near-fatal encounter with institutional bias. The Richardson Protocol had been implemented by every major airline in the United States, requiring crew members to undergo extensive training in medical emergency recognition and unconscious bias mitigation. Flight attendants now learned to recognize the signs of serious medical conditions, regardless of the passenger's appearance, and captains faced federal oversight of their medical emergency decisions. Dr. Michael Thompson, who had become something of a celebrity in medical circles for his role in saving Amelia's life and advocating for aviation medicine reform, was appointed to head the newly created Federal Aviation Medical Advisory Board. His first initiative was establishing direct communication links between commercial aircraft and ground-based medical specialists, ensuring that future passengers with serious medical emergencies would have access to expert consultation, rather than relying solely on crew judgment. What happened to Dr. Richardson revealed a gap in our aviation safety protocols that we never fully recognized. Thompson explained to a gathering of airline executives and medical professionals at the board's inaugural meeting. We had procedures for mechanical emergencies, weather emergencies, and security emergencies, but we had no adequate safeguards against bias and assumption in medical emergency response. The changes extended beyond protocol implementation to cultural transformation within the aviation industry. Airlines began partnering with medical schools to provide realistic emergency response training, using scenarios based on actual cases, including Amelia's, to help crew members recognize their own potential biases and understand the life and death consequences of dismissing passenger medical concerns. Monica Chen, who had been released from federal prison after serving 6 months of her 8-month sentence, found herself working as a case study rather than a cautionary tale, participating in airline training programs where she shared her perspective on how bias had informed her disastrous decisions. Her participation in these programs was part of her court-ordered community service, but it had evolved into something more meaningful as she began to understand the broader implications of her actions. I saw what I expected to see rather than what was actually in front of me. Monica told a room full of flight attendants during one of these training sessions. I saw a young black woman in casual clothes and decided she couldn't be telling the truth about being a doctor. That assumption nearly killed someone whose surgical skills are irreplaceable, and it destroyed my career and my life. Don't let bias make you into someone you never thought you could become. Trevor Walsh's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all the principals involved in the incident. His bankruptcy and criminal conviction had forced him into a complete reassessment of his life and values, leading him to establish a foundation using the remnants of his assets to fund medical emergency training for transportation industry workers. The irony that his briefcase accident had nearly killed someone who now inspired improved emergency response wasn't lost on him, but he had chosen to channel his guilt into productive action rather than self-destruction. I can't undo what I did or take back the things I said, Trevor admitted during a foundation fundraising event where Amelia was the keynote speaker. But I can make sure that other people in positions like mine understand that dismissing someone's medical concerns based on assumptions about who they are could literally be a matter of life and death. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond aviation to include training programs for emergency responders, hospital staff, and other professionals who might encounter medical emergencies in their work. The focus was always on recognizing and overcoming bias that could interfere with appropriate medical response, using Amelia's case as the central example of how dangerous assumptions could become when applied to life and death situations. Captain Blake Harrison remained the most resistant to acknowledging the full scope of his failures, though his federal prison sentence had provided considerable time for reflection. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked. His marriage had ended in divorce, and his prospects for future employment in aviation were non-existent. Unlike Monica and Trevor, he had not become involved in reform efforts, choosing instead to maintain that his decisions had been based on legitimate concerns about passenger safety rather than bias. His refusal to engage with the broader implications of his actions had made him something of a pariah within aviation circles, where the Richardson case had become mandatory study material for pilot training programs. His name would forever be associated with the kind of bias-driven decision-making that the industry was working to eliminate, serving as a cautionary example of how authority without accountability could endanger the very people it was supposed to protect. As Amelia completed her first week back in surgery, successfully performing 3 complex cardiac procedures without complication, she reflected on how the worst experience of her life had ultimately led to protections that would help ensure no future passenger would face the same dismissal and endangerment she had experienced. The tremor in her hand would always remind her of how close she had come to losing everything, but it also reminded her that survival sometimes meant more than just personal recovery. It meant transforming trauma into protection for others who might face similar challenges. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity as Senator Patricia Hargrove called the Aviation Medical Safety Subcommittee to order her gavel echoing through a space that had become the focal point for one of the most significant aviation safety discussions in decades. 18 months after Dr. Amelia Richardson's near-fatal encounter with airline bias, the federal government was preparing to enshrine the changes her case had inspired into permanent law. Senator Hargrove, a former emergency room physician who understood the medical implications of the case better than most of her colleagues, had championed the legislation that would become known as the Richardson Protocol. The comprehensive aviation medical safety reform addressed not just the immediate issues revealed by Amelia's case, but the broader patterns of bias and assumption that could endanger any passenger who didn't fit stereotypical expectations about credibility and authority. We gather today, Senator Hargrove began to ensure that no passenger will ever again face what Dr. Richardson experienced, being dismissed, disbelieved, and endangered by the very people responsible for their safety, simply because their expertise didn't come packaged in the form that crew members expected to see. The legislation before Congress was sweeping in its scope, requiring fundamental changes to how airlines approached medical emergencies and passenger treatment. The core provisions mandated that any passenger claiming medical expertise must be taken seriously regardless of their appearance, that crew members receive extensive training in recognizing unconscious bias, and that direct communication links be established between aircraft and ground-based medical specialists for consultation during potential emergencies. Dr. Amelia Richardson sat at the witness table with the same calm authority she brought to the operating room, her testimony serving as the cornerstone for legislation that would protect millions of future passengers. Her prepared remarks focused not on her individual trauma, but on the broader implications of bias in emergency medical response, drawing connections between her case and larger patterns of discrimination that could prove fatal in high-stakes situations. Senators, Amelia began, "My case illustrates what happens when assumptions about credibility are based on appearance rather than evidence. Captain Harrison and his crew saw a young black woman in casual clothes and decided I couldn't possibly be telling the truth about my medical condition or my professional credentials. That bias nearly killed me, and it could kill others if we don't take action to prevent it." Her testimony was followed by Dr. Michael Thompson, whose perspective as both her mentor and the federal official who had coordinated her rescue provided crucial context about the broader implications of the case. Thompson's testimony revealed that Amelia's case had prompted a comprehensive review of how critical medical personnel were protected during travel, leading to enhanced protocols for all federally designated medical assets. What we learned from Dr. Richardson's case, Thompson told the subcommittee, is that expertise and authority don't always come packaged in the forms that people expect to see. The crew's failure to recognize her credentials and take her medical concerns seriously nearly deprived our nation of someone whose surgical skills are literally irreplaceable. The aviation industry's response to the proposed legislation had evolved significantly since the initial incident. While some airlines had initially resisted the increased training requirements and oversight provisions, the legal and financial consequences of the Richardson case had made clear that bias-driven medical decisions posed unacceptable risks to both passenger safety and corporate liability. James Patterson, representing the Airlines for America Trade Association, testified in support of the legislation with an enthusiasm that would have been unthinkable before Amelia's case. The aviation industry recognizes that the Richardson case revealed serious gaps in our medical emergency response protocols, Patterson acknowledged. We support these reforms because they will make flying safer for everyone and help ensure that crew members have the training and resources they need to make life and death decisions without bias. The transformation in industry attitude reflected more than just legal necessity. It represented a genuine cultural shift toward recognizing that passenger safety required confronting and overcoming the assumptions that could interfere with appropriate emergency response. Airlines had discovered that bias training and improved medical protocols actually enhanced their operations, rather than burdening them, leading to better customer satisfaction and reduced liability exposure. Monica Chen, who had completed her federal prison sentence and was now working as a trainer for aviation bias recognition programs, provided testimony that was perhaps the most powerful of the entire hearing. Her perspective as someone who had lived through the consequences of bias-driven decision-making offered insights that academic experts and industry officials couldn't provide. I destroyed my career and nearly killed an innocent person because I let assumptions override evidence, Monica told the senators, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had paid the full price for her mistakes. Dr. Richardson showed me her medical credentials, described her symptoms with clinical precision, and requested appropriate medical evaluation. I dismissed all of that because she didn't look like what I thought a doctor should look like. The Richardson Protocol will help ensure that no other crew member makes the catastrophic mistake that I made. The legislation passed the Senate by unanimous vote, a rarity in contemporary politics that reflected the broad recognition that Amelia's case had revealed issues that transcended partisan divisions. The House of Representatives followed with equally overwhelming support, and President Harrison signed the Richardson Protocol into law in a ceremony attended by Amelia, her colleagues, and the passengers who had supported her during her darkest moment. The signing ceremony at the White House represented more than just legislative victory. It symbolized the transformation of individual trauma into collective protection. As President Harrison handed the signing pen to Amelia, he acknowledged that her case had revealed truths about bias and assumption that extended far beyond aviation medicine. Dr. Richardson's courage in standing up for her own medical expertise, even when faced with dismissal and threats, has made air travel safer for everyone, the president said. But more than that, her case has reminded us all that expertise and authority come in many forms, and that our assumptions about who deserves to be believed can literally be matters of life and death. As the Richardson Protocol took effect across the aviation industry, its impact extended beyond the specific provisions of the law to represent a broader cultural shift toward recognizing and confronting bias in high-stakes decision-making. Flight crews began approaching passenger medical concerns with enhanced sensitivity and awareness, understanding that dismissing such concerns could have consequences that extended far beyond customer service failures to include federal criminal charges and the destruction of professional careers. The protocol's implementation also sparked similar reforms in other transportation sectors, as bus companies, cruise lines, and train operators recognized that the same biases that had nearly killed Dr. Richardson could endanger their passengers as well. The ripple effects of her case continued to spread through industries and institutions that had never considered how assumptions about credibility could interfere with appropriate emergency response. 3 years after the incident that had nearly cost her life, Dr. Amelia Richardson boarded a Delta flight from Boston to Los Angeles with the same destination, but a completely transformed experience. The moment she stepped onto the aircraft, the difference in crew training and awareness was immediately apparent in ways both subtle and profound. The flight attendant who greeted passengers at the door, Maria Gonzalez, recognized Amelia immediately not from her appearance, but from the comprehensive training that now included her case as a central example of how bias could endanger passenger safety. Rather than the casual dismissal that had characterized her previous Delta experience, Maria's greeting carried genuine respect for someone whose expertise had literally changed aviation medicine. "Dr. Richardson, welcome aboard," Maria said warmly. "Please let me know if there's anything you need during your flight. We're honored to have you traveling with us today." The acknowledgement was professionally appropriate rather than obsequious, reflecting the industry's evolution toward recognizing passenger expertise while maintaining normal service standards. Amelia appreciated the respectful treatment, but more importantly, she appreciated what it represented about broader changes in how airlines approached passenger interactions. Captain Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Trevor despite the shared surname, made a point of greeting Amelia personally before departure. As a black woman who had risen through the ranks of commercial aviation, despite facing her own challenges with bias and assumption, Jennifer understood the significance of Amelia's case better than most and had become an advocate for the reforms it had inspired. "Dr. Richardson, I wanted to personally thank you for the changes your case brought to our industry," Jennifer said during the brief greeting. The Richardson Protocol has made us all better at recognizing and responding to passenger medical emergencies without bias. Your courage in standing up for appropriate medical care has literally saved lives. The conversation was brief and professional, but it represented something profound about how Amelia's case had changed not just airline policies but the culture of aviation medicine itself. Crew members now understood that dismissing passenger medical concerns could have consequences that extended far beyond customer service failures to include federal criminal charges and the destruction of professional careers. As the flight progressed, Amelia found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The tremor in her left hand had continued to improve with therapy, though it would never completely disappear, and her surgical skills had returned to their pre-injury level. But beyond the physical recovery lay the deeper transformation that had come from turning personal trauma into collective protection for others. The medical foundation she had established with part of her settlement money was now funding bias recognition training for emergency responders across multiple industries, while her speaking engagements at medical schools and professional conferences had helped spread awareness about the dangerous consequences of assumptions in high-stakes situations. Her case had become mandatory study material not just in aviation training, but in emergency medicine curricula, where it illustrated how bias could interfere with appropriate patient care in any setting. Midway through the flight, a situation arose that perfectly demonstrated how the Richardson Protocol had transformed aviation medical response. A young Latino man in coach began experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath symptoms that could indicate anything from anxiety to heart attack. Under the old protocols, crew members might have made assumptions about the seriousness of his condition based on his age and appearance, potentially dismissing his concerns as panic or attention-seeking behavior. Instead, the crew immediately activated the enhanced medical response protocols that Amelia's case had inspired, establishing direct communication with ground-based cardiologists while treating the passengers' concerns with appropriate seriousness, regardless of their initial assessment of his condition. The consultation revealed that his symptoms were consistent with a cardiac event requiring immediate attention, leading to an emergency diversion that potentially saved his life. As she watched the crew's professional and unbiased response to the medical emergency, Amelia felt a profound sense of satisfaction that her trauma had served a purpose beyond her individual recovery. The young man receiving appropriate medical care could have been her 3 years earlier, dismissed and endangered by crew members who let assumptions override evidence and expertise. The successful emergency response also demonstrated how the Richardson Protocol's provisions for ground-based medical consultation had eliminated the burden on flight crews to make life-and-death medical decisions without appropriate expertise. Captain Walsh's decision to divert the aircraft was supported by cardiologist consultation, rather than based solely on her assessment of the passenger's credibility, creating a safety net that protected both passengers and crew from the consequences of bias-driven medical decisions. After the emergency landing and the passengers' transfer to local medical care, Captain Walsh made an announcement that acknowledged the seriousness with which the crew now approached all passenger medical concerns. Ladies and gentlemen, we successfully responded to a passenger medical emergency that required immediate attention. I want you to know that we take every medical concern seriously, and we have protocols in place to ensure appropriate care for any passenger who needs it. The announcement was brief and professional, but Amelia recognized the significance of its implications. 3 years earlier, she had been threatened with arrest for requesting medical evaluation of her own potentially fatal condition. Now, airlines were publicly committing to taking every medical concern seriously, understanding that appropriate response was both a moral imperative and a legal requirement. As her flight continued to Los Angeles, where she would be delivering a keynote address about bias in emergency medicine, Amelia realized that her journey had come full circle in the most meaningful way possible. She had survived being dismissed and endangered by people who should have protected her, and she had transformed that experience into protections that would help ensure no future passenger would face the same dismissal and potential endangerment. The tremor in her left hand would always remind her of how close she had come to losing everything, but it also reminded her that survival sometimes meant more than just personal recovery. It meant transforming trauma into protection for others, turning individual pain into collective progress, and ensuring that expertise and authority were recognized regardless of the package in which they appeared. As the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, Amelia looked out the window at the sprawling city below and reflected on how a single moment of trauma had ultimately led to changes that would protect millions of passengers for generations to come. Her case had become more than just a story of individual survival. It had become a catalyst for the kind of institutional change that could prevent others from facing the same dismissal and endangerment she had experienced. The work wasn't finished, and bias would probably never be completely eliminated from human decision-making. But the Richardson Protocol represented a significant step toward ensuring that assumptions about credibility were based on evidence rather than appearance, and that expertise was respected regardless of the form in which it appeared. For someone whose life had been saved by her own medical knowledge and her refusal to accept dismissal, that transformation represented the most meaningful legacy possible. Dr. Amelia Richardson's story reminds us that bias isn't just about hurt feelings or social awkwardness. Sometimes it's about life and death. When Captain Harrison looked at her, he saw what he expected to see rather than what was actually there. He saw assumptions instead of evidence, stereotypes instead of credentials, and nearly cost the world one of its most gifted surgeons. But this story isn't just about the dangers of prejudice. It's about the power of persistence, the courage to stand up for truth even when authority figures dismiss you, and the incredible impact one person can have when they refuse to accept being silenced. Amelia's refusal to sit down and be quiet didn't just save her own life. It changed an entire industry and created protections that will help countless future passengers. The Richardson Protocol now ensures that medical expertise is respected regardless of who possesses it, that emergency responses are based on evidence rather than assumptions, and that no passenger will ever again face what Amelia experienced simply because they don't fit someone's preconceptions about what authority looks like. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most painful experiences transformed by people brave enough to turn their trauma into protection for others. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Share it with someone who needs to remember that expertise comes in many forms and that everyone deserves to be heard when their life is on the line. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the person you dismiss today might be the one holding the power to change everything tomorrow.